Your support helps us bring you programs you love. Go to wyomingpbs.org, click on Support, and become a sustaining member or an annual member. It's easy and secure. Thank you.
Yellowstone National Park Superintendent Cam Shali is a veteran of the National Park Service, and now he's been at the helm of the world's oldest national park for just over 1 year. In fact, he grew up just a few miles away from the park's northern border. What are the issues with Yellowstone with its over 4 million annual visitors? A status report from Superintendent Cam Sholly, next on Wyoming Chronicle.
Funding for this program was provided by the members of the Wyoming PBS Foundation. Thank you for your support.
And as we begin our discussion on Yellowstone National Park, it's our pleasure to have the, is this now your sophomore year, Superintendent?
I just started my second year, so.
Cam Sholly here is with us this evening in a beautiful, just renovated Mammoth Hotel.
That's right. Yep.
Tell me a little bit about that. It just reopened in August.
Well, it's really a great example of how we can balance protecting some of the most incredible historic resources in the country, but build them for kind of 21st century expectations. And so we did a ribbon cutting here in August. This project's been going on for several years. It cost about $25 million, was on time and on budget, and was part of an earlier project that upgraded the room we're sitting in here right now and some conference space upstairs. But I think it's really become one of the best accommodations in the national park system.
We'll have a lot of time to talk about your history with the national park system, but you went to high school, actually, I've learned, inside Yellowstone National Park.
That's right.
Yeah, tell me about that.
Well, I went to 4 high schools, and I finished here I did half of my junior year and my senior year here, and graduated from Gardner. Proud Bruin graduate.
Bruin.
The high school back in the mid-'80s burnt down in Gardner. And so when that happened, they actually used one of our camps up here, our youth conservation camps, for the high school temporarily for 2 years. So between 1985 and around 1987, kids from Gardner actually attended high school in the park.
And your first job was slinging burgers right over there?
Right. Between my junior and senior year, I flipped burgers here at the grill next door. After graduating, before going in the military, was scooping ice cream and working in the sporting goods section of what used to be Ham Stores, now Yellowstone General Stores.
So was it with a fishing pole walking back and forth to work? Is that when you developed a love for the outdoors?
Well, no, I've grown up in parks my whole life. I was fortunate to live in Yosemite and Crater Lake and Hawaii volcanoes, and I've been in a lot of national parks throughout my career. My father was in the Park Service. My grandfather was a superintendent in the Park Service, and so proudly third generation. My son's going to his senior year right now in Gardner, and who knows what the future holds for him, but he's had a very enjoyable time here in the park, as has my wife. They've been here since June. So I've been here since last October, and it's been a fantastic year.
Just prior to that, you served in the Midwest region, responsible for multiple parks.
Yeah.
In Omaha.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about that job, and then we'll get into all things Yellowstone.
Well, we had a great team there in Omaha. That regional headquarters for the Midwest was there. 61 parks throughout the Midwest in 13 different states, basically between the Dakotas and Ohio and Canada down to Arkansas. Great team out there, great diversity of parks, and had a lot of fun in that job.
And here we come to Yellowstone. Do you feel like you're back home, or this is just somewhere that you've always wanted to be? Why are you here?
Well, I'm privileged to be here. I mean, this is an incredible park. Represents some of the very best of America. It's a global icon. There's no shortage of opinions in the park and out of the park about what we should be doing here and how we should be doing it. But that's because people care, and people are very passionate about this place, whether it's the wildlife, whether it's the geothermal resources, the cultural historic resources. People from around the globe travel here for a reason, because it's such a spectacular place. So to be in charge of it and to work with such an incredible team as we have here is a privilege. And it's not just the Park Service team. The partners that we have in the park, non-Park Service, and outside the park are incredible as well.
So you're acutely aware that 4 million folks come in between the gates and come to appreciate Yellowstone every year. And now you've had a year to contemplate what that impact really means to Yellowstone, whether it's in user experience or whether it's on impact on our natural resources. What have you learned, and what does that 4 million number mean to you?
Well, let's remember it's not 4 million individual visitors. So it's 4.1 million visits. I think that equates to about 1.2 to 1.5 million individual visitors coming into the park. This park's 2.2 million acres, and it's bigger than Rhode Island and Delaware put together. That's 3,500 square miles. Now, the vast majority of this park never even sees a visitor. The road corridor, which makes up about 300 to 350 miles, represents about 1% of the park, and so.
Which 99.99% of the people stay.
Right, and so we have, at certain times of the year, in certain locations in the park, substantial issues with traffic, with too many people in certain areas, and things that we need to work on together to really manage more effectively over time.
You look at your Facebook page, as you well know, it says right up front this: pack your patience, expect busy boardwalks, traffic delays, and limited summer parking. And for those of us who grew up here in Wyoming, that doesn't sound like a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But you have to manage that.
Well, our survey from last year, and my predecessor, Dan Wank, did a fantastic job here with the team on a variety of areas we can talk about. But one of the things they did was one of the largest surveys, visitor use surveys in the Park Service's history that was done last year. And we're getting a lot of data from that.
What are you learning from that?
That number one, the people that come here are having a really good time overall. We have a very, very high, upper 80s, low 90s% good to excellent visitor experience rating. We're learning that people are not quite as frustrated as we might think that they are in regards to sitting in traffic and looking for parking and that kind of thing. Now, in certain areas, there's more problems than others. We also found that almost 70% of the visitors that came last year were first-time visitors. And so I think part of that is the mindset. And so for someone like you or I who've been here many, many times, and you've seen the park evolve with visitation over years, and you know how long it used to take you to get from here to Old Faithful or somewhere, versus someone coming for the first time that has no baseline there, and comes from Los Angeles or somewhere there's a lot of traffic. I mean, the traffic's bad comparative to what we might be used to in Yellowstone, but if you're sitting on the 405 or on 95 in DC or something like that, it's all relative, right? And so.
And for those of us who live in Wyoming, they say no thank you to that.
Yeah.
But yet they have expectations for the park on how they can get from Old Faithful to Mammoth,
right.
For instance, and do remember how it used to be. So
we're focused on 4 areas.
Is it managed a little differently for the regional traveler versus the national traveler, the person that you mentioned maybe from the West Coast?
We have different expectations, and you have, and there's different. There are people that are coming here time and time again, year after year. I met a guy the other night in DC that has come to Yellowstone every single year since 1993. And when he comes, he knows where he hasn't been, or he knows where his favorite spot is, and he knows exactly how to trip plan, where to go, and all that. But the vast majority of visitors that come here don't necessarily know that. And so are we doing what we need to do to make sure that we're understanding what the impacts of increased visitation are to the resources of this park, one. Do we understand what the impacts are to staffing, operations, and infrastructure? And that's a big one. You put 1 million more people in 5 years in this park, that's 1 million more people flushing toilets, wastewater treatment facility impacts, traffic congestion, that kind of thing. Do we understand the impacts on the visitors, on the visitor experience? And do we understand what the impacts are in the gateway communities? And how do we look at those 4 areas that are critical to visitor use management and make sure that we understand and we can respond effectively in each one of those categories?
You said it early on in your tenure that you didn't anticipate any sort of cap system or reservation system. After a year here, are you still thinking like that? Or might there be the day, if visitation continues to grow, where things like that might have to be managed a little differently?
So I've said that, and at this particular moment in time, there's no plan, nor are we thinking of implementing a visitation cap or implementing a reservation system or something like that. And I think you need to look at, in those 4 categories I just mentioned, a spectrum. And over here you're doing nothing. And over here you're doing extreme measures to manage visitation, including capping visitation. Or in many areas, we've done nothing over here So having a conversation about capping visitation to me is a little bit extreme just as a starting point. So have we identified what the problems are, and have we identified what the solutions need to be so that we can progress with our partners, our gateways, with our team here in Yellowstone, with the right options and actions that are necessary to manage effectively. And those may not be really extreme. We may get there someday, but we should get there together, and it shouldn't be a surprise. And I would suggest that, I get asked regularly about comparisons to Zion and Acadia and other parks that are managing some of these visitation issues more aggressively than us. Zion's way ahead of us. I mean, they've had shuttle systems in place for 20 years. The geography in Zion, it's a 150,000 acre park with 4.5 million visitors versus 2.2 million acres with 4 million visitors. A lot we can learn from them, but we've got to progress along that spectrum and really understand what we're trying to do there. And where's that starting point? Where's that conversation? So we could get there at some point, someday. We're not there right now, and I think that it's important that we do everything we can on this side of the scale first before we get to that, and understand that once again, the vast majority of the visitors are staying within a very small percentage of this park.
So the average fee to get in the park is $35 per vehicle.
Right.
Okay. What are your thoughts about that? There have been talks of making it a little more expensive.
Well, I mean, we've done 2 fee increases since 2015. The Park Service budget, give or take $3 billion plus overall for the system. Yellowstone's portion of that's about $35 million. It's the biggest budget in the system. Our staffing levels have stayed generally flat since about 2006. Well, if you look at a visitation line, obviously since 2006 it's gone up. So that gap there is impact. And how do you deal with impact? And people can argue all they want about how you deal with that, but the bottom line is our ability to manage successfully hinges largely on financial capacity. And when you break down $35 per car for a week, it comes out to like $1.20 per person per day in that range for a family of 4. And so, when you look at what normal people do for recreational activities per person per day, you look at the gap that we have from a revenue standpoint. Our entrance fees make up in this agency about 8% of the money proportional to our total budget. So we couldn't live without them. But I would argue that 20 to 30% last year were international visitors, or not American taxpayers. Is there a conversation to have about the people that are coming to this park who are having the most direct impacts? American taxpayers contributing to the greatest system in the world. The people that are actually visiting these parks probably should pay more. I don't know what that number is. I know that's a very politically charged issue, but I think when you break down what the impacts are of a van full of 10 people coming in for $35 for a week, or even for 3 days, I think a good argument, and you look at the amount of deferred maintenance that we have, the operational gaps that we have, I think a good argument could be made that we should have a conversation about where additional revenue comes from.
Speaking of revenue, we all saw that President Trump recommended cutting the National Park Service budget. And that, I think, would have impacted, fair to say, it would have impacted Yellowstone. Congress might feel differently about that. But what do you feel about that? And what do you take away from the president's, if you believe a budget is a sign of priority, not prioritizing the parks maybe where you would like it to be?
Look, we had Vice President Pence and the Secretary of Interior, David Bernhardt, out in June. We have congressional delegations that are extremely supportive. The president and the administration in many ways have helped us improve construction funding to address deferred maintenance, an incredible amount of support in a variety of different areas. And there are a lot of competing priorities in the government budget. It's a big budget. And so I think that conversation has to occur whether you're talking about fee revenue or you're talking about federal appropriations. There's a gap in regards to the operations of not only Yellowstone but the National Park System. There's a very large deferred maintenance bill that needs to be looked at and addressed. That deferred maintenance bill amount that you hear, the $12 billion, needs to be put into proper context. $12 billion on $180 billion in assets is about 7%.
Right.
I would suggest that you're always going to carry some large percentage of deferred maintenance on an asset portfolio that big.
Give us a feeling of what the deferred maintenance priorities are for you here in Yellowstone.
Yeah, so we reported out about a $580 million deferred maintenance number last year. We think that number's higher. About half of that's in transportation, roads, pullouts, parking lots. Remember that most of the infrastructure, whether you talk about the bathrooms, the pullouts, the parking lots, the roads, were built when this park had less than 1 million visitors. And you've got 4 times that much. So you've got, one of the projects that we're working on next year, that road between Tower and Mount Washburn hasn't been worked on since the 1930s, substantially. And so you've got aging infrastructure with a lot of use. You've got safety issues that are associated with that. You've got 10 wastewater treatment facilities beyond their life cycle right now, probably cost about $10 million each to get them where we need to be. We've got employees living in trailers that we need to take care of. That's a top priority. From a workforce standpoint, housing is our top priority. Everything that we do in regards to recruitment, retention, being able to provide one of the most incredible teams I've ever worked with living accommodation. I mean, if you want to have fun, you go live at Grant Village in Yellowstone National Park in February, and we say, no connectivity, get your own DirecTV or your own satellite, live in structures that maybe haven't been improved for 20, 30 years, ride a snowmobile for 2 hours to get your groceries, and then we'll charge you rent. There's some of these places that we actually, we should be paying them to live in. And, and then when you look at the gateway communities who have really flourished in regards to economic spending because of tourism in this park, a lot of the traditional housing market has turned to VRBO and Airbnb. And so when you have new employees coming in looking for housing, they can't afford it. It's not available.
It used to be available for rent 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Now it's
so,
out of the market.
we're going to solve this problem ourselves. This administration and Secretary Bernhardt especially has been incredibly supportive of helping us address this issue. And we are on a very aggressive timeline over the upcoming years to spend millions to get our employees out of trailers and into quality housing. And that's something that we feel very strongly about accomplishing for the employees that are protecting this park. And it's not just Yellowstone that has that issue. I mean, it's parks across the country that have issues with housing that need to be addressed system-wide.
Housing issues aside, are you able to recruit the talent that you need to work here in Yellowstone?
Well, because it's Yellowstone, it's an icon. We have an incredible group here that, like I said, is one of the most dedicated teams I've ever worked with in all kinds of different areas, whether it's PhD wildlife biologists or law enforcement rangers or our education rangers or our financial management unit. It's just an incredible diversity of talent, and they come here because they care about the Park Service and they really care about Yellowstone. But there are definitely issues that we have with recruitment, and a lot of that is directly associated with the either housing availability or the condition of housing that we have. And so we need to fix that.
Superintendent, I want to talk about climate change. It's always in the news, it seems to me, with Yellowstone. From what you've learned in your year here, how might that impact how this park will be managed over the next 25 to 50 years? Is it more of an issue than even you contemplated, say, 10 years ago or so?
Climate change is an issue everywhere. It's going to be an issue. It is an issue. It's something that isn't new. It's something that we will continue to use science and every means possible to try to predict what impacts might occur on any number of things within this ecosystem. As an example, invasive species. I think that's a really big threat. If you came in the north entrance, you saw cheatgrass, which is a highly flammable grass that's proliferated in the whole area around Gardner there. And it's starting to come into the park, and it's moving further and further into the park. The Park Service is really good at watching things happen. The question is, are we willing to take actions aggressively early in order to combat something like that? 100 years ago, we killed all the wolves in this park. We killed all the grizzlies. We almost killed all the bison. 50 years ago, you were feeding bears in garbage dumps, so people could feed them and even pet them and things like that.
Crying out loud, yeah.
And we think we've come a long way. In a lot of ways we have. I mean, this ecosystem's been put back together in many ways. It is probably health-wise in better condition than it has been in over 100 years. But then you get to the 2000s, and if you follow the lake trout issue at Yellowstone Lake, I mean, we almost lost the cutthroat trout as a keystone species of this park in the 2000s. And thanks to a lot of people.
And a lot of money.
And a lot of money. Government money and philanthropic money. And a lot of talent with our fisheries biologists and partners. We're on top of that one. Where the lake trout numbers are continuing to decline, cutthroat numbers are continuing to increase. And we've gotten very aggressive, and we've used techniques that we probably wouldn't have thought we might use 20 years ago. You know, we've put geo-trackers and created Judas fish so we know where they're spawning for these lake trout, so we can go in and kill the eggs. We're looking at potentially dropping these biodegradable pellets, and we actually have already done it to some degree, but on a large scale that can kill the spawning sites. We might have to actually do that with kind of a crop duster almost, that can drop the pellets in mass on these spawning sites so we have maximum impact on killing lake trout. The point there, back to your question on climate change,
Sure.
is lake trout first started showing up in Yellowstone Lake back in the 90s. And we watched it, and we watched it grow. And we took some actions, and we thought we were doing a good job. Now we're at a point where we're dropping, we're using all kinds of highly sophisticated and kind of antiquated means of killing lake trout. On the cheatgrass issue, we're seeing it. So are we gonna wait until it proliferates the entire northern range of Yellowstone before we get on top of it and start spending, $2 million a year to combat it, or do we try to take some more aggressive action now to prevent it? In regards to other climate change impacts, I mean,
Wildfire mitigation.
Wildfire mitigation, I mean, we had what's called a masticator, which is a big machine that kind of grinds up dead and down logs and trees. We've been very aggressive in trying to clean up areas that are in and around structures for structural protection, for life safety reasons. That's a little bit of a shock to the conscience in national parks. Yosemite, 15 years ago, we were doing it mechanical thinning on a regular basis. I think the public's starting to be more aware. I'm not saying let's take bulldozers to Yellowstone or anything like that, but clearly these impacts are happening. The seasons are longer. Fires are burning, in November, December, some years where that would have never happened, 20 years ago. We've got to be much better prepared to address that and then understand how parks can serve a larger narrative in relationship to the laboratories they are for science and for research. Our Park Service policies, our policies have evolved quite a bit in regards to adaptation, where we build structures, how we build structures, if we build structures, or how do we make sure that what we're doing is resilient, whether it's natural resources, cultural resources, or any of the other impacts that come to us from a climate change perspective.
How is the park experience maybe going to change? And I ask that in the context of my parents wanted something different out of Yellowstone, I think, than my millennial kids do. And then maybe my grandkids will. Is the park experience going to change over the coming decades?
I think it's a fair question. I think, you look at baby boomers versus Gen X versus millennials versus my son's Gen Z. You got Generation Alpha coming. You have a different perspective. What I find regularly in the forums I talk in is people that are very nostalgic about their visits here in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s or even the 80s and 90s, and how they experienced it, in many ways technologically free, and how they valued that experience, and they want that experience for these newer generations. The problem is that can be hard to reconcile when the expectation of the new generation is quite different than what was available in 1965. And so, I get this question a lot in regards to connectivity in the park, cellular, Wi-Fi in hotels. Should we do it? And I will never do anything in regards to technology that compromises or degrades the resources of this park. But as technology evolves, and it is evolving quickly, if I look at cellular, even purely from a public safety standpoint, putting 4 million people a year in a 350-mile road corridor, communications is necessary. I mean, it's just plain and simple fact. When it comes to expectations in regards to social media, whether it's Instagram or Twitter, we have a large number of people who come here who want to share their experience worldwide, and they need connectivity to do that.
They want to do it now.
And is it my job,
Yep.
and I would say no, to tell them that I'm going to make a decision to not allow connectivity in this park because I don't want them to use social media? That's a choice. And so insofar as it does not affect the resources of this park, we will continue to expand and upgrade our connectivity, whether it be through cellular or other means, so that we can have adequate public safety communications, and so that visitor expectations for those that want it can have it available.
Well, Superintendent Sholly, congratulations on your first year here.
Yeah, thanks.
Best
Appreciate
wishes
being
to
here.
you as you
Yeah.
manage Yellowstone.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks
Appreciate
a
it,
lot for
Craig.
joining us on
Yep.
Wyoming
Thank you.
Funding for this program was provided by the members of the Wyoming PBS Foundation. Thank you for your support.